Let's take a closer look at Kentmere 400 by Ilford. I wanted to do some more film comparisons to Tri-X like I began earlier in the year. But to keep things consistent, rather than do them every now and then, I went ahead and got 49 different film stocks, everything I could get in 35mm from B&H and Freestyle. So unless they were out of stock, I got a roll of it. Now, if this part of the video seems familiar, it's because I'm using this portion of the video for all 49 of them rather than record it 49 times. So if you want to skip ahead to the H&D curves or the prints, time codes are right over here. For those of you that haven't seen this part of the video before, here's what I've done. So I wanted to use each film with the exact same shot, which is a headshot of me with a Kodak Gray Card Plus, which happens to have a red, blue, and green patch, a cyan, magenta, yellow patch, and then a dark and a neutral flesh tone. Then, with those shots taken, I bracketed every shot in third of a stop so that we can make sure we have a negative of equal shadow density to the base target film of Tri-X. Now, the reason I use Tri-X is because it's just been around for a long time and it's a very popular film. So it's a good base film to compare everything to. Then, once everything was developed, which was developed in D-76 at stock for the manufacturer's recommended time, I printed everything on Ilford using the exact same aperture, contrast settings, developer, and everything. The only thing I changed was my exposure time, and that was to make sure that I compensated for any base fog variation from one film stock to another. Other than that, everything was left the same so that we can have a comparison of just the qualities of the film. Now, there's going to be some differences in contrast, especially on the high end, and that's because the manufacturers getting their development time may not have used the same target that Kodak used for Tri-X. And that's okay. We're not looking at the overall contrast for everything. What we're really looking at is grain characteristics, tonality, how the film treats the shadows versus the highlights, that sort of thing. And we're looking at spectral sensitivity, thus the Gray Card Plus, rather than just a regular gray card. So we're going to go ahead and look at H&D curves, which if you saw one of my earlier videos on sensitometry, I like to use pen and paper and make my graphs. However, my wife was really ready to make sure I was done with this project. So she put everything into a spreadsheet for you all. So even though I don't like them, I want to show them to you thanks to her. Then we're going to go ahead and look at the prints side by side with the same print made from Tri-X. And from there, you can decide if you like the film and if you want to go and use it. So let's go ahead and take a look at the curves, and then we'll go to the prints. We can see that the overall line of the curve is relatively the same, but the Tri-X, which is the blue line, has this sort of belly out right after the toe, which is kind of the low to mid tones, where the Kentmere does not have that. What that means is Kentmere has more of a linear gradation from black to white. It's got a little bit of a dip up in the highlights, but for the most part, it's fairly flat. The Tri-X, where it bellies out in that low section, it shows that when there is a step of exposure, we don't have a full step of shadow. So we're kind of losing a little bit of separation between some of our dark tones. So the Kentmere will have a little bit better separation than Tri-X in those tones. But then when it starts getting up into the mid-tones, the Tri-X has a little bit steeper of a curve. This is where that belly starts to rise. That means we're having better separation in the mid-tones than Kentmere. Then once we get up into the highlights and the upper mid-tones, they really track pretty close to one another. Here we can see our two prints. We have Tri-X, we have Kentmere. They're both 400 speed films, and as we saw from the graph, they really kind of track one another in terms of gradation. So not a whole lot difference through every bit of it. Let's go ahead and look at our spectral sensitivity first. So of course we have our chart with the two flesh tones at the top, dark and light, then our primary red, green, and blue, secondary cyan, magenta, yellow. And we can see that, quite frankly, between the two there is virtually no difference in spectral response. So we can expect full spectrum response throughout the entire film. That's good. So neither one's going to lean towards blue or red, and should be about even. Now when it comes to actual gradation in the tones, they're exposed and processed pretty equally. We saw that the Kentmere had just a little bit higher whites, but in actual print practice they're coming out pretty much the same. When it comes to subtle gradation in, say, the mid-tones, so I mentioned that the mid-tones are going to separate a little bit better with the Tri-X, as we saw in the curve. Because we had a little bit steeper curve, that means we're getting higher steps or separation of the gray tones as we go in steps of exposure. And I think we can kind of see that, particularly in these areas versus this area. It's subtle though. I mean, you really have to look at them side by side, otherwise you wouldn't see a difference at all. If I didn't label these, quite frankly, you probably wouldn't be able to tell which one was which. Now I realize on camera they might look a little bit different. That could be because using like copy stand lighting, I've got a light here 45, a light here 45, and while I do my best to get them equal color balance and polarization and brightness, there might be some variation, but looking at these side by side, they look pretty darn equal. The only real difference I can see, if I really had to nitpick, would be this shirt might be just ever so slightly darker than this one, but that could just be the lighting in here. I don't know. All right, let's get a little bit closer to each of these and check out some of the fine detail and the grain. So here we can see some subtle gradation from light to dark, and the differences are very, very hard to spot, if there are even differences at all. We really are kind of getting the same shadow detail fall into shadow here, and it falls into full black here, and we're getting about the same sort of highlight in the forehead here. So not much difference in that regard. When it comes to grain, they're both traditional style films. They're both 400. They both exposed at 400, so I felt like I got full film speed from both films at 400. Looking at the magnification, the grain doesn't seem all that different, but when you look at some of these, the grain almost looks smoother on the Tri-X. It doesn't look larger, it just looks a little bit smoother. Alright, thank you for watching. I hope that gave you a little bit of an idea of what to expect should you shoot Kentmere. I find it a very good 400 speed film. The tonality is fantastic. Grain is what I would expect from a 400, and it's certainly exposed at box speed, so can't go wrong with it. Get out there, shoot some film, and we will see you next time.